I'm Barbara Mead. I came in specially to introduce Myra because that I'm so enthusiastic about this book. Myra's going to tell you some things that you never learned in school in American history. But even though the school didn't teach it to you, the History Book Club has now chosen Myra's book, Scarlet Sisters, as a selection of the History Book Club, so that they've given it legitimacy, and the story legitimacy. And they also say McPherson brings these outrageous and inspiring sisters to brilliant life. I thought that was a wonderful description, Myra. Myra didn't even know that they had chosen her. The History Book Club had chosen her book. As most of you know, Myra has had a long career as a journalist for the Washington Post, as well as writing for the New York Times and numerous other media. And she's here this evening to talk about her new book, The Scarlet Sisters, which is the 5th book in her award-winning career. And she's come really kind of full circle now. Her first book, The Power Lovers, address the issue of women's rights also, as this new one does. But Myra also has had her own collisions with this issue of women's rights. When she was hired by Ben Bradley at the Washington Post and was banned from sport boxes while covering the World Series as well as the Indianapolis 500. She then went on for the style section to write a number of in-depth profiles, and among those profiles were the Vietnam vets, and that led to an acclaimed classic, Long Time Passing, about the Vietnam vets and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then in 2006, she wrote All Governments Lie, about the life and times of the journalist Izzy Stone, who was a wonderful customer of ours as he lived right up here, and we treasured him as a customer. All Governments Lie won Fordham University's Ann Sperber Award for the best biography of the year, and the Boston Globe named it one of the best books of the year. Okay, now in this new book, with this new book, Myra has a new publisher. The name of the publisher is 12. They're an imprint of Hachette that used to be Little Brown. And the imprint does exactly what its name says. They only publish 12 books a year. They're not like Simon & Schuster and Random House who publish in the 200s and 300s. They limit their books by their mission to choose talented authors who deserve attention from readers who will be enriched by the author's work. So Myra is one of those 12 for 2014. Also, The New Yorker has chosen Scarlet Sisters for its new feature, Books to Watch Out For page. They say the Scarlet Sisters is a lively account of the unlikely lives of the two most symbiotic and scandalous sisters in American history. The Boston Globe describes it as a sweeping, engaging new biography, and the Washington Post, our own Washington Post, calls it a captivating dual biography and adds, this is a quote, in an epilogue containing a litany of misogynist low points in modern politics, from legitimate rape to government-mandated ultrasounds, McPherson hammers home the point that even in 2014, powerful men treat women's bodies as bargaining chips. So here's Myra to tell us a little bit about scandal and a little bit about women's rights, too. Thanks, Myra.
First of all, are there any more chairs, I wonder? Because people are sort of stuck standing. I don't want to bore you for... I don't want to bore you for a half an hour of talking if you can't sit. Anyway, can you hear me? I'm okay? All right. First of all, I want to thank Barbara, and I also want to thank my son, who I think is here, unless he's hiding. But he's endured my cooking for much longer than anybody should, and he's also been very faithful about my book and gave me a great applause speech the other night, so I wanted to thank him, and then all of my buddies who are here, and then the people that I hope will buy the book who don't know me. Anyway, I'm one of those people who's terribly nervous about giving speeches. I mean, I've gone trips to the dentist that were more fun than standing in front of people. And I had one story I have to tell you because it kind of solidified this fear. And I was giving a speech, and everybody was listening very nice, and everybody was looking at me like, okay, except one woman. And she was in the front row, and she didn't do anything. She didn't move her mouth. She didn't smile. She didn't not smile. She didn't, I'd say something, and she just looked like this. And I got madder and madder and madder. And you know, politicians have told me they can get 95% of the vote, and they want to know who the other 5% were. Well, that was me, so I kept staring at her and talking. So finally I said, look, in the Q&A, maybe you have some thoughts you'd like to express. And the woman next to her said, oh, she's from Germany. She hasn't understood a word you said. So now I try to think if you're not reacting, it's because you're from another country. But anyway, and what intrigued me about these women, these fascinating free love sisters and feminists, is that they became unbelievable orators. They spoke to crowds of 6,000 and more, and we're talking at a time with no amplification. But Victoria, the first time, almost fainted when she gave a speech, and then her sister Tenny spoke so loudly. She was this bodacious, beautiful little 24-year-old that people's ears were ringing, and they had to tell her how to moderate her voice. And so they were the most amazing women to me because they crawled out from absolutely nowhere and became both famous and infamous for their free love stance and everything else. And people always ask me, why or how did you get the idea of doing them? And in 2008, we were talking about the idea of a dream ticket for the Democrats, which would be excuse me, Victoria Clinton. Anyway, Hillary Clinton and Obama. And I read this little squib that said it had been done before. In 1872, a small third-party group nominated Victoria Woodhull and Frederick Douglass as her running mate. And so I said, this is really interesting. And so then I discovered her cheeky younger sister, and I said, everything before had been written just about Victoria, so I ended up writing about the two of them. And they called for equality in the boardroom, the bedroom, and even the battlefield. And Tenny shocked everybody when she became the first and only woman colonel of a black regiment. And they just were, I think, born to shock in some ways. And they came from an absolutely horrible background of trash, and we're talking about an era where trash really was trash. I mean, we're talking the Victorian era where you had this strata of people at the top and then everybody else was down below. And your lineage, even though a lot of people were making it up as they went along, stemmed from the Astors and from everything else. And if you were something like these sisters, you had no hope at all. Their con artist father had them read fake fortune telling from the time Tenny was 11 years old. She would sit in a hotel for 13 hours at a stretch, making up and trying to elicit ideas that would make people, and of course her father would collect all the money. And she tried to run away from home. Her sister ran away and married a drunk, and then they both decided that they had to start out on their own. And guess what they did? They went to New York, and they found out that there was a very rich man who believed in spiritualism, to the point that they were able to convince him that they could probably talk to his very, very dead mother at any point. And it turned out to be Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. And he bankrolled them, and the story is that he was Tennessee's lover as well. But he bankrolled them, and they became the first women to own a stock brokerage firm in America, not to be equaled for almost 100 years. They had 2,000 people showing up to see them. And they had the police. They had 100 policemen to keep guard. And it was just a spectacular moment. And they decided that they had to do something to be even more distinguished. So they dressed alike as if they were twins, although Tenny was 7 years younger than her sister. And they wore skirts that were scandalously short. They were you could walk without hitting the muck and manure of the streets of Manhattan. And they put two gold pins in their ears, pens, and just to sort of show that they were able to do business. And they cut their hair short. They did everything possibly to get attention. And they got so much attention and they got so much money that they went on ahead and pursued a group of feminist firsts that you can hardly imagine from that period. First of all, Victoria ran for president. That same year, in 1872, Tenny ran for Congress. This is 50 years before women could get the vote. And their argument was that the Constitution said nothing about against women running for office. It just didn't mention it, so why not? And then they continued on and became the first women owners of a very radical paper. And in that paper, they discussed everything that you can imagine, from prostitution to equal pay for women, which we still don't have, and they covered financial and political corruption, religion, race, sex in and out of marriage, and they said that any upper crust women who married for money were nothing more than practicing legalized prostitution. And as I said, they were these great self-promoters, and Victoria decided that she was going to be the first woman to address Congress. So she made friends with Ben Butler, who was the richest and the smartest and the quite ugliest man in Congress, but great friend of Lincoln's and then Grant's. And he, the story is maybe they had an affair, maybe they didn't, but he managed to get her to speak before the Judiciary Committee, and she was the first one to speak on the argument that because the Constitution and because most of the amendments all said citizens and persons, that women should be citizens and couldn't vote. At which point, John Bingham, who had written the 14th Amendment, said, "Madam, you are not a citizen." And she said, "What am I?" And he said, "You are a woman." And then they went on. And then, as I said, and then they loved communists and capitalists alike. They became the first women to run one of Karl Marx's sections of his international union that he had started. And they included African Americans, women, abolitionists, everybody they could drum up for their group. And it was considered, finally, Marx just drummed them out of the Corps and said, you're just too crazy for being women and blacks and all of this and that. And so they said, oh, you're nothing but a fallen despot. And then history, however, does say that this was the first attempt since abolition to try to change the racial disparity. So they had these missions, but they also had this ambition to be who they were as well. And they continued fighting for everything. And above all, they railed against Victorian hypocrisy regarding sex. Some of their lectures are really quite interesting. I want to give you one quote or two. I'm not trying to take up a whole lot of time, but there is this one that I think most of us who live in Washington would be quite interested in. With her piercing blue eyes, Victoria observed life at the Willard, watching the after-hours coming and going of congressmen and lobbyists, and later shocked audiences with her observations. Where is prostitution in its greatest luxury? Washington. Everybody knows what the third house in Washington is. It consists of the lobbyists who are there. You know the word lobbyist came from Ulysses Grant, who saw all these people walking through the Willard and said, oh, you're nothing but you're crowding up my damn lobby. You're just a bunch of lobbyists. And so that's where the phrase started. But anyway, she says, it consists of the lobbyists who are there to obtain legislation, to push this little scheme or that small appropriation. Lobbyists distributed to brothel madams $10, $15, and even $20,000. To spellbound audiences, Victoria asked, why? To secure their influence with representatives and senators. I say it boldly, that it is the best men of the country who support the houses of prostitution. We could argue about the best men, but anyway. and then Tenney was absolutely, totally just driven about the double standard in every walk of life for women. As you all know, I'm sure, in those days, women didn't own anything. They were pretty much owned by their husbands and their fathers. And if they had to try for a divorce, it was very difficult to get. And if they did, they were ruined, and they were not allowed to have their children. So many of the free lovers who got this bad rap of just, I don't think it's a bad rap, but a bad rap of being able to pick whom you want when you want to, were really also pushing to change the divorce laws and make life. They were the real feminists. And anyway, this is what she said. Her compassion for prostitutes led detractors to say this was a pursuit that Tenney knew all too well. Why were prostitutes arrested while their clients went free, she asked, and threatened to expose clients who were the best men in town? Why should an unmarried woman who became pregnant deserve disgrace while the man who impregnated her was never asked to account for anything, she cried. Now I say that the poor prostitute, suffering for bread and naked for clothes, who sells herself to some man for a few hours to obtain the few dollars with which to procure them, and thus sustain her life, or the young maiden involuntarily yielding herself up to him to whom her young heart goes out in purity, is an angel compared to this woman, she's talking about a rich woman, who sold herself to the man she detested for $100,000. But such is the force of public opinion that while the prostitute would be kicked from the doorstep and the unmarried girl who engaged in sex was with a man she loved would be turned from her father's home, the designing young married woman is worshipped as a belle of New York, a virtuous woman. So you can imagine how well their story went over with a lot of people. And they finally came to the final moment in their life, and that's when they blew the whistle on Henry Ward Beecher's adulterous affair. And they printed it in this radical newspaper they had, and they ended up, some of the papers were sold for $40 a piece, which was a huge amount of money, because he was the most famous man in America, and he had the whole Beecher dynasty behind him. He had his sister who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. He had the other sister who was a spinster, but told everybody what you should do to get to be a mother, which she didn't know, and a wife, which she didn't know. And so they had these big guns going after them and made their lives miserable. And the sisters really played the game that men played, because that was the only game to play. And they were very, very tough about it at times, and rather unscrupulous. For example, when some of the women's movement started trashing them, they wrote a piece called Tit for Tat, and they sent all of these women the sheet, the proof sheet before it published, and about their adulterous affairs, and said, if you don't shut up about us, we're going to print this. And they didn't think it was blackmail. Of course, it absolutely offended Susan B. Anthony. She couldn't imagine it. But when they did do this expose, they were put in prison by a man named Anthony Comstock, who became one of the absolute worst people, Mr. Vice Squad. He was a single one-man vice committee who decided that anything that was ever printed or even drawn had a sinful moment to it. I'm sure he would have said that if somebody read the Bible to him, but he really did say that about medical books, anything that showed any illustrations of bodies and everything. So he was very successful in getting a federal bill passed called the Comstock Law that raged till the mid-1920s and was a terrible free the First Amendment problem all the way through, and also hit on famous authors like H.G. Wells and everybody, George Bernard Shaw. And so the sisters really made him, because he was an unknown until he put them in jail. And he was their Javert. He followed them everywhere. They were in and out of prison for 4 years on trumped up charges of obscenity. They came out, they were absolutely wrecked and absolutely broken. And in fact, their whole printing presses had been destroyed by the federal government. I won't tell you exactly because I want you to read it and what actually happened to them, but they have a last final act that I think is quite amazing. But they just decided after they got out of, actually they were acquitted, that they couldn't take it anymore to be in the United States. So they went to England and married two of the richest men in England and lived happily ever after. They had to forego the free lover quote. In fact, as I said, they were very good at making up their own lives. And so Victoria said, they just did this draconian idea. We've got to appeal to these people. We've got to appeal to these upper class people we're marrying. And so they said, we never said a thing about free love. They still fought for women's issues. And Tenny became Lady Cook for the rest of her life, and a long life, I might add. And she, although she had been eclipsed by her sister much earlier because of the Beecher fracas, she actually became the one who continued with the women's movement and went all over the world using her Lady Cook title and her money to push for women's rights until she died. And I guess it's a good place to end. She died. Anybody want to talk to me?
Okay, we've got two mics for questions, one here and one here.
I can talk about anything you want me to, but...
Here we go.
1923, and the vote was 1920, and her sister died in 1927. And then as soon as she died, it was very convenient for the first book to be written, which slammed. I mean, I've spent a ton of research trying to figure out what's real and what isn't real in their lives. And the first book was carried on forever, and much of even the stuff she made up was considered actually factual. And in fact, one of the ways I want to explain about their chutzpah about things is that the New York Times wrote a scathing piece about them and ended up saying, it's hard to imagine that two such women would come from such the same family, but it is obvious that it's true. And so they turned it around and said in their newspaper, this is praise from the New York Times. It's hard to imagine. And so they were always finding an edge out. And actually the men they married fell madly in love with them. They had a great life.
What do you attribute their power, the synergy between the two of them? How much of that power and effectiveness came out of that synergy and the cross-fertilization between the two of them?
Well, that's really quite a fascinating thing because I found it as I went along. I wasn't even sure I was going to have enough on Tenny because she was never in the biographies. And then I luckily found an awful lot of newspaper articles, and also I found private letters between the two of them, which showed this symbiotic relationship lasting throughout their lives. It began when Tenny was left alone, as I said, with this horrible family situation. And then when Victoria came back, and you can read and see, but there's quite a sense of perhaps she was running a house of assignation. She may or may not have been. There were never any files, but they were really under the thumb of their father. And as she said, I owe everything in my life to Victoria and her then husband because they took me out of this hell I was living. And she just dedicated her life to being there for her sister. And the sister, while she had a lot of stage presence, was the one who was really very wobbly. I mean, I think she had a couple of nervous breakdowns. I discussed that in the book. And she always had Tenny, the younger one, there for her and to support her and to take care of her. And then even in the one of the great things about Lady Cook is she owned a castle in Portugal. Now, how could you ever imagine that's coming from this dirt poor family, going around on a wagon, telling fortunes in terrible hotels. And so she would write letters to her from Portugal that were really quite interesting. They started out having no education. I mean, they could scarcely read or write. They were so déclassé for the middle class women's movement, and they suffered strongly for that. And also, they were evicted when Tenney went off with 4 of the African American soldiers. The guy said, if you go out with them in that carriage, you're going to be gone. And they came back, and all their luggage was out on the street and everything. And they had this nerve center for a future. And in fact, Victoria used to say, I'm really 100 years ahead of time, and it's really more like 144. Look at what we're fighting now. We have, vaginal probes, people arguing whether there is such a thing as a legitimate rape. We're having all the same kind of people. What were the moral majority who fought against the ERA were exactly the same kind of people in the 19th century who were saying, you can't have these freedoms, you can't vote, you can't do anything. And a lot of them were women. I mean, the suffragist movement was a minority. And they just sort of felt that everything centered on you being able to be your own free self. And they said, they really clashed with Susan B. Anthony because she said, the vote was everything and didn't want any of these other parts. And the sisters said, no, if we're going to have to vote for the same corrupt and weak men, it doesn't mean anything. We have to have women running, and we have to have money. And they fought very hard for women to get into jobs and positions. That's why they joined the laboring group. So they were crusaders, but also very self-absorbed, which I think makes them interesting.
Hi.
Hi, Michael. This is my son.
I was trying to get out of this without getting identified as that.
No, and I didn't plan this.
This is not planned or paid for. There were actually 2 questions I wanted to ask, but the first one actually has to do with prostitution and the amount of times that you mentioned it. It sounds like these women were, to put it cavalierly, champions for, or at least would be seen as champions for working class women at the time, and prostitution was probably one of the jobs that
Absolutely.
was most available, sadly. In your research, were you able to find anything that, it must have been difficult to find it, but were you able to find anything where there were working women who actually talked about these sisters and what they had to say and champion?
No, I didn't, but the interesting thing was that at one point there was a listing of 20,000 prostitutes in New York. I have a chapter called Sex in the City circa 1871, which goes into a lot of the brothels and the houses, and the large percentage of the women who went were domestic workers who had gotten tired of being chased around the bedroom by the master and getting no money, and they just said, why don't we do this? The working women, they tried to organize the labor class working women and join them, and they did have a rather effective moment with that when they had the Yankee International Union until that got exploded. But I don't think, and they talk often about knowing prostitutes. They actually went in and interviewed them and told how much the payola was and how much it cost them for towels and to rent rooms and everything. So there's a whole period in the book where it describes what these young women had to go through, and they went largely out of necessity financially. And another thing is that there were so many people taking morphine and derivatives, laudanum. I mean, you could get anything in a drugstore, and many of the prostitutes took it to dull their lives, as did upper class women who were bored stiff in marriages that they hated. I mean, you had to really understand the hypocrisy was so strong in that period of time, and under the underbelly of this idea of modest life, in Victorian America, where all these things were happening.
Second question is actually a little more current, and it's given knowing your bodies of work, everything from going through Watergate, Vietnam, but mostly women's issues and the women's movement, covering the ERA. When Hillary, if Hillary decides that she's going to run, the Democratic Party, at least for a long time, seems like it's been bereft of any kind of standard bearer for women's issues. Elizabeth Warren gets elected and people start to talk about it and it pops up. But I'm just curious in terms of the general election in 2016, how you see, or potentially how you see, the women's issues on the national stage versus the demagoguing, demonization, everything that we know will come with a general election.
Well, I
and an open
think that
White House.
even if she doesn't run, I think we're going to see an incredible Klieg light shown on the women's issues. It's happening already, and it's moving. And I have been meeting with some of the Emily's List women and others, and even though we have only 20 women in the Senate, which is not a majority, and they have been able to band together. It's very fascinating. Both sides of the aisle, the Republican and the Democratic women in the Senate, came together, and they were the ones who forced to stop the closing down of government. And there's some real hard-charging women there. Gillibrand, for example, here is Tenney talking about how women should be able to join the army, and here's Gillibrand saying, yes, but we have to watch out for the sexual harassment that happens. And I just think there's a real rebirth. A lot of us here, unfortunately, are old enough to have lived through the rebirth in the 70s, and there was this momentum, and I feel it strongly, and I'm certain if she runs, it's going to be there. But we're also going to have sexism with it. We have seen already Paul Rand tried to nail her guilt by association about Monica Lewinsky. Mitch McConnell, one of my favorite people, has decided that he is running against a woman who he called, as a spin on the empty suit joke, empty dress. We have Wendy Davis running. I think this was amazing. Here was Victoria and Tenney, who were trashed for coming from what would be trailer park trash, in their day. And then Karl Rove, another one of my favorites, said that that really Wendy Davis just wasn't trashy enough. She'd only been in that trailer 3 months, And I said, "Oh God, if this is the way it's going to go, And unfortunately, they've got all the money in the world behind them. Yeah. So it'll be an interesting to play out. And thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Better than the answers. Yes, my dear. Oh.
Well, isn't there someone over here?
Oh, I'm sorry. You have to stand. I'm
But
sorry. It's
why
my
don't you
fault.
come to the
It's my
microphone?
fault.
Myra,
Yes.
Richard Reimland has just explained to me that this is actually your stealth campaign for 2016.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that correct? Is that it? Yeah. But I'm happy to see you focusing on the
Hillary is the
Issues
pacer.
you love.
She's the pacer. I come in after.
sex, scandal, all those good things. But here's my question to you. Quite serious. Where did it come from? You used the word chutzpah, the two sisters.
Yeah.
But call it what you want. Drive, determination, originality, assign all the words you want. Where did it come from? It didn't come from Buck, their father,
No.
who was a snake oil salesman of the First Order, and so it doesn't come from it. Where did it come from?
Well, my dear, I'm going to actually read what I wrote because I think that is about the best question, and it's the one I struggled with throughout the whole book. And it's very hard when you don't have somebody writing their history at the time that they were alive and really getting to know who they were. But the thing I did find was that they were basically, I felt that they were driven because of that background, totally driven because of that background. I said there was a deeper drive, an almost impossible one to achieve from their low station in life. They wanted riches, but in order to be independent. They wanted power, especially Victoria. They also wanted to do something meaningful. It would mean using men to serve them, but they wanted to be among the small band of Victorian women who could command their own lives. Like many politicians and public figures, they had competing desires. Altruistic beliefs about changing the world, especially for women, vied with raging ambition. Victoria promised to drive herself until she reached her divine destiny. She was the one who truly believed that she had powers to talk to people on the other side of the world and everything else. And Tenny just sort of came along for the ride. And I said Tenny would be there for the sister she felt had saved her from a life of hell. Despite Victoria's messianic peculiarities, self-absorption, and manic fervor, Tenny would devote much of her life to her. Their horrid childhood and poverty, with its meager pleasures, had been good training, just as it had been for so many of the uneducated men born in poverty whom they would join on Wall Street. Most of them were illiterate, and, Daniel Drew, all of them were just out of poverty, and they just climbed and climbed. And it was an era when you could climb. There was so much corruption going on that whatever you did was hardly even noticed, I mean, you had the Grant administration, you had Tammany Hall, you had everything, and they just sort of joined in on it. And I said, the sisters had learned cunning and had known con artists, albeit on a penny ante scale. Now they were prepared for the big time, unafraid of running with the high-rolling bandits who were forging Wall Street's emergence as the center of the financial world. The sisters headed for their new future with a consuming fierceness that made them an unstoppable force.
But did they have models among the
No.
women of the day?
No, of course not. They didn't. I mean, I think I've said that, but I certainly say in the book they had no models. Look at in the 1920s. You look back, how many models were there really? I mean, it's taken a long time for women to be able to sit there and say, I know a woman that when I was a kid, when you wanted to find out where had a very adult reading level, very young. That's the only thing I did that was any smart to it. And I remember they would let me have special dispensation to go in the adult reading section, and they would hand out books to me, and they'd be books like Clara Barton, Girl Nurse, and we didn't have, in our lives even then. And then it was, I said, it was totally a man's world. There was nothing they could do. And as I said, they used these men in a way, both because they were charming and because they were really, really street smart, and they intrigued them. And they intrigued them, and they intrigued Vanderbilt because they were so daring and dangerous. The men they worked with on the Hill in Wall Street were all risk takers. They'd earn money one day, lose it the next, and they felt right in with that. And I think that whole childhood was something they had to escape from, but it was also what gave them the strength to fight. Any more?
Well, I read a biography of Victoria Woodhull when I was a child. It was probably similar.
The bad one. It was the 1927 one, probably.
But anyway, I still found it inspiring, and I wonder if you could talk a little more about their campaign for the presidency, and also about the role of Frederick Douglass, which I hadn't realized. Did they speak at a lot of places? Did they get scorned? And did they get any votes?
It was really a moribund thing. They started out, well, as I said, all this time this was going on, they were also being cornered for what they were saying about the Beecher family. And they were on election day. They were in prison. I mean, but when they started, Victoria clashed very strongly with Susan B. Anthony. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was in her corner. She was a wonderfully lively, funny woman, by the way. And I've got some good stuff in here from her. But she was her mentor and sort of pushed her in the movement. And everything was going along fine until Victoria said, I want to run for president. And so then they had a big meeting in New York, and she tried to usurp center stage And she raced up and and she had her claque there. All of the people were going to go back to her group with her. And so they all cheered her on. And Susan B. Anthony got up and said, you're out of order, sit down, huge screaming match and everything. She ran off, found the working man, and asked him to douse all of the lights. I mean, the gas lights, not electric lights. And so there's Victoria standing in the middle in total darkness. But she picked up her crowd and went over and had her own rally, and there were 600 people there from all across the country, but a very mixed group. I mean, there were American Indians, there were it was her Rainbow Coalition. It was not anything like the other parties, which were all white male. And in fact, the suffragists were complaining because they didn't have any horse in the race anyway. They didn't want Grant, and he ended up getting elected, but they also didn't want Greeley, who was very anti-divorce laws and everything. So they didn't really have a hell of a race. And at the same time, Douglas' house was burned down by arsons, they think. And there's a really interesting part in the book about him, and I don't want to hold everybody up, but what had happened even before the sisters is that there had been this huge split between the abolitionists and the suffragist movement as to who should get the first vote, and the men were all saying, abolitionist males were saying it's the Negro's hour, and the sisters were saying, Anthony said, I'll cut off my right arm if I vote for a man before a woman. And it was a huge fight in 68, 69, and 70, and then the sisters came on the scene in 70. So you had a kind of watered down women's movement to begin with, and then when Victoria took over, it was like an enemy for life with Susan B. Anthony. And that is also one of the reasons why a lot of people don't know about these sisters, because they were drummed out of the history on women's suffrage. The women just flatly said, they're not here. They erased them from history's pages.
Thank you.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Okay. There's references and so forth at giving lectures. Would people come and listen to Victoria in particular, or to Tenny as well?
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And pay to do
so?
so?
Yes. They were very good at that. They would have huge signs, we're going to discuss prostitution, divorce, blah, 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 and everybody would come and pay. And in fact, at one point, there were 10,000, and they had to turn away 4,000, and everybody was accusing them of selling too many tickets, sort of scamming their own speeches. And they were able to rise above boos and hisses and catcalls and continue talking. I really wish I knew them. It's very hard to sort of you get a I think a pretty good glimmer of who they were, but they were amazingly outspoken women.
Would you say that their major...
And actually, Tenny, at age 64, had two 7,000 audience speeches at Royal Albert Hall. And they also got into eugenics, which was a very popular movement in those days. And it was when you look at it now, it's shuddering to think of the way people talked about that. And also Victoria had her son was a majorly deformed son and an idiot. I mean, that's the way they described it. And she always thought it was her husband's drunkenness. But as you read in the book, venereal disease caused a lot of things that people didn't know, including sterile women and children that were terribly deformed. So it could possibly have been that, because at least she describes him as somebody who was out there prowling night after night. So I don't know.
Would you say that their major impact, in fact, might have been as entertainers?
At the time, but but what has happened is that there's been, as I tried to say, there have been these echoes that continue and continue and continue. And now, like Pat Schroeder, the longest woman congressman, and a friend of mine said, I just adore Victoria and Tenny. I mean, they spoke to so many women in these days to come. And as Tenny and Victoria both said, they thought that they would be appreciated in further generations. And so when you talk about their legacy, I like to say that it came, very posthumously, but it came in that way. And as I said, Tenny continued on until she died, fighting for women's causes. So they were both inspirational. And in fact, what was funny is that they would give these speeches all around the country, and the newspapers would say they said things we couldn't possibly print, and so people wouldn't know what they were saying, but they would end up saying, "But we're not ready for this yet." I mean, this was a paper in Michigan. We're not ready for these things yet, but we admire them for presenting them. So they had both those who thought they were great and those who thought they were not great. They were called prostitutes in newspapers. The newspapers are an interesting thing about this period because I use a lot of the newspapers, and the biases, particularly the capitalist biases, are very interesting.
Thank you.
No one on that side? Okay.
I was wondering if you could focus a little bit more on the relationship between these two women and Vanderbilt. I mean, you mentioned how he was a risk taker, they were risk takers, but he must have, to get as far as he did, he couldn't have been a stupid man. And
no.
And you mentioned how they were trailer trash. He obviously came from, had a better pedigree.
Not much.
No?
No.
What was it about them that made him
well, I think he was very
sympathetic
much
to them?
Intrigued by Tenny, who was young, and he was 74 at the time. And she would sit on his lap. Supposedly, these are all history things in his office, and he'd call her his little sparrow. And his wife had died. This was not, I want you to know, a feminist. This man, when his wife who had 13 children by him, refused to come to his house and live there and stayed in Staten Island, he clapped her into an insane asylum till she came to her senses and moved in, at the house on Washington Square. I have an awful lot on Vanderbilt in here, but he came out poor as anybody and worked his way up, and he was 6 feet tall, and he was brawling he was a shipyard kid, and worked his way up to everything. And he did not associate with a lot of people, and particularly those who wanted something from them. And the sisters just captivated him. And Tenny was very funny. I mean, she had a great sense of humor. She used to say that she really loved the newspapermen. They were the salt of the earth, and they kept everything from spoiling. and when they were in they were in Delmonico's, the famous restaurant, and they came in after work, and there was just the two of them, and the owner came over and belt down and whispered and said, you can't be in here without a male escort. And Tenny had just ordered soup for two. So Tenny said, just a minute. She ran out. She got the carriage driver off of his stop, dragged him in, and they were sitting there with his boots on and his red top and everything. And she said, soup for three. So I think they were captivating. I mean, particularly in an era where these women were they go on and on in this book about how they don't like the rich women who just sit around and do nothing with their lives. And then there's they take off on the clothing, the fact that a bustle was 20 pounds heavier on you, and why would you be so stupid as to do this? And they were really, really outspoken about all of that. And Tenny always said, they think that the word leg on a table is obscene, but they go to parties with everything down to here, and she would write about that. And in fact, it was quite an interesting period because the women who were fashionable actually painted their face with enamel, and it, lead and everything else that was in it. God knows how long they lasted, but they did. And then they had, if God had not been terribly kind to them, they ended up having plumpers for their breasts, and they were like little mini lifesavers, that you could blow up. And I said in the book, the reason that they didn't hug you fiercely had nothing to do with Victorian morals. It had to do, they were afraid that one of those would just pop in the middle of a hello. So I do an awful lot about the life and times. And for example, the Fifth Avenue Hotel, when it was built, after the Civil War, was praised for having a vertical railway through each floor, meaning an elevator. It was the first elevator, and there was actually a subway that was started back then. And so it's the life, and actually I'm speaking to the New York Historical Society about their life in Manhattan, so that's another story. I'm sorry. I don't know how much time we have.
Time for one last question.
Hello.
Hi, Myra. Congratulations on your great book. They came on the scene in the beginning of the recording and film era,
No.
right?
1870?
Right. I mean, there was
There was
film, but not recording yet.
They had the daguerreotypes, but they had.
Well, my question.
And they had cartoons, and but they didn't have any.
My question is, were you able to hear any recordings
No,
or see any
absolutely
film
not.
of them?
There wasn't anything.
Okay.
No, and I think it really was too early. I
And
was
it-
looking for some for later, and I couldn't find any. I found a lot of newspaper articles, and magazine articles, but I couldn't find any of them. I wanted to hear them. I assume they started in Ohio, and I think that they probably had a Midwestern voice. They were described as having very pleasing voices. Once Tenny learned how to control it, and Victoria, I think, had one of the great gifts of all time that we would all love to have, which she had the gift of total recall. And so she could, go on for 2 hours at a time, marching back and forth on the stage, flinging her hair back and, giving all of this talk without having to think.
Second part of my question is, they're obviously very articulate and funny, great rhetoricians. Given their circumstances where they came from, where did they get that from?
That's a very good question. I'm told I hope you buy the book because I'm talking about everything that's in it. That's no fair. Anyway, they as I said, they used men. Well, the one man who really helped them enormously was a man named Stephen Pearl Andrews, who was a quirky, eccentric man who learned 30 languages. He learned the Pitman writing. He was an abolitionist, and he tried to teach all of the black slaves how to do Pitman so that they could understand words without reading it. And he was their mentor, and he wrote an awful lot of their stuff at one point. And in fact, people are critical of that, but in many ways they were like, they had their own speechwriter, just like politicians do today. But when they got on the women's issues, it was always themselves. The others, she spoke to a group on finance and had everybody enthralled. She had all these statistics, et cetera, but there's no evidence that she knew anything about it. It was just what she did because he wrote it and she said it. Thank you. Sorry.